Um, well, Alexander, we need your input for that. What's the best way to approach that now, considering that we will have, as I said, 7 or 8, I guess, Verena, if you help me, it should be 7 presentations and 7 times giving feedback. Is it possible to do that in an all plenary?
Yes, you can do it. What is kind of nice, because I read your recommendations. I read the theses. I all got them, and you can ask questions about the recommendations. So the recommendations sometimes are a little bit vague, and then a critical friend can say, "Hey, I read the one about the restaurants in Groningen. Yeah, you want them to be open. How do you see that? What kind of grade? Yeah, so the best way to become a critical friend is somewhere when you end your presentation with one of your recommendations, and then we're going to ask questions about the recommendations, because those recommendations, because you know way more, because you work months on it, on how to get there. Yeah? So the practical route is that you end your presentation with one of your recommendations, and we will ask some critical friend questions about this recommendation.
That
Yeah?
sounds good. And then it would mean presentations should not take longer than 7 minutes, so that we have 7 minutes of questions for each student.
Yeah, correct. And then when you give your answer on your recommendations, of course, you can go back to your research and come up with proof and everything. Yeah, so we start all the way at the end, and then you can actually show them that you know your thesis from A to Z.
Well, then I would say let's get started. Again, keep your presentations, even if you prepared a lot more material, keep that for your defense. You will be able to use all of that, but keep your presentation sharp and to the point and no longer than 7 minutes. Now, Joyce, I know I haven't asked you or warned you beforehand, but would you be comfortable to go first?
Hi, yes, of course, I can start. I will just check how I can share the presentation.
Yeah, Verena, make sure everyone gets the rights to do that, please. And also maybe Eisling can have a look at the time and give us a signal after 5 minutes each time. Maybe just in the chat that you give a signal like 5 minutes. No one will be interrupted, but we are all on the same track then. Is that in the system, Alexander?
Yeah, that's the system. And the idea is that you learn from each other. So this is knowledge sharing and asking questions, and don't be afraid to give answers.
So you can all see the presentation right now? Or...
Yes, we can.
Okay, and do you only see, yeah, the presentation, right? Okay, perfect. I prepared it for more or less than 10 minutes, so I will try to hurry a bit through it. Well, first of all, welcome to my GPJ presentation. I did also the GPJ for the startup ADR, of course. The topic is related to culture and cross-border collaboration, and mainly about the influence of German cultural experiences among Dutch startups within the entrepreneurial ecosystem, EDR. Well, first of all, the agenda, a short introduction about the topic, motivation and background, the methodology with the approach and sampling, research questions about the sub one and the main one, then the results and discussions, and of course we have the conclusion and recommendations. So first of all, a short introduction. Well, I did the GPJ for the startup ADR for this final semester to graduate. My interest is in cultural differences, and the startup EDR, of course, is focused on the cross-border region, so that fulfills the requirement for personal interests. Different literature is used of various scholars. I used Hofstede and Trompenaars, but also other academic sources. And to summarize shortly, the research problem for this thesis was to explore the opportunity to how Dutch startups experience the German culture and real life experiences in cross-border collaboration. Based on the outcomes, recommendations will be made for the start of ADR to promote further and attract Dutch startups to cross-border collaboration in the EDR region. So the methodology, there's a short visual that combines the main aspects. The study's cross-sectional applied, an inductive approach is used. The purpose was explanatory research. Semi-structured interviews have been conducted. All primary data is subjective, and the goal was to enhance the richness of the data. So 3 different samples are used or have been used, and that covered an expert. The second one is startups that had the ambition to cross the border, but not yet have crossed. And the last one are startups that have crossed the border originally from Groningen and that could tell about their stories. Further limitations cover that the study was only focused on the EDR region of Dutch startup perspective, and the amount of participants was limited to 7 interviewees with one expert and 3 startups of both the categories. The research questions with the theoretical framework. So the main research question was how the cultural aspects of real life German experience influenced Dutch startups from the province of Groningen in expanding their business across the border to Germany. Then followed by the sub-questions, how do experience differences between Dutch and German culture affect startups who have expanded or plan to expand across the border. The second one covers what German cultural aspects cause challenges or barriers for Dutch startups to cross border. And the last one, what interventions are needed to reduce or remove cultural challenges and barriers to cross-border business expansion. What is mainly focused on the recommendations. Well, first of all, the results, followed by the objective of the perceptions. So one interesting finding was that the startups with the ambition, so that not have crossed the border yet, according to their previous experiences, don't experience real serious differences between both cultures, and that related to their ambition to cross the border, no really need for advice. So they highlighted that it was not really necessary or possible, but no need. Quoted, we are the same, there's not much of difference, and there's no serious strategy needed to cross the border because both regions are comparable. However, contradicting the startups that crossed confirmed the opposite. So there are significant unexpected differences, and there's a high need for advice and support in cross-border collaboration, especially on the cultural part. Mistakes were made that should easily been overcome and anticipated on because there was no expectation in high differences. Then following to other results. So the main differences indicated by the interviewees among both cultures are related to trust issues. Germans prefer German staff or German speaking people. That was not expected by startups that already crossed because they thought we can just cross and communicate easily, but there was a high difference. As well in employment issues, Germans are not the same as Dutch people in employment or expectation management, so that was a struggle. And of course, language that has a high influence. Startups indicated indeed to speak German or have a native on board because Germans generally, based on the interviewees, prefer to speak German in the outcomes. So then followed by the needs, definitely advice beforehand. That's clearly needed with a strategy implied. So don't cross the border without a strategy because that will result in mistakes that could have been overcome. Training is required in employment situations or generally cultural differences. Recruitment, it's harder or it was difficult to find the right German employees, especially that work similar to Dutch people because there were highlighted differences. and also the need for tailor-made information due to the specific industries all startups work in. And then looking into promotion of cross-border collaboration, the need is there for creating a platform for consultation with experts to receive support. And these consultation with experts, it's kind of a network that exists from Dutch and German companies or startups and that benefit from each other. The objective is to enhance the relationship between both countries. And by creating this network, interesting advices or stories can be shared that work beneficial for both startups. And of course, include those experts, Chamber of Commerce's, other startups with success stories. The really goal is to have an interactive platform to spread knowledge instead of keeping it all for yourself, really spreading knowledge from, for instance, startups that have their success stories that cross the border, startups that still have the ambitions are highly interested in those stories. Then continuing with the conclusion. So based on the structure of the sub-research question 1, that represents how the experience differences between Dutch and German cultures affect startups who have expanded or plan to across the border. So first of all, significant differences between startups with ambition and startups that crossed. The startups that have not yet crossed are not aware of the highlighted differences, and that has a huge impact on the actual crossing, because unexpected situation will occur because they're not prepared. And the main differences are focused on management style, the language, expectation management, employment issues, hierarchy, and trust issues. Then the second research question that covers what German cultural aspects cause challenges or barriers for Dutch startups to cross the border. Well, it can be concluded that culture influences startups in cross-border collaboration, mainly because of the deprived strategy that startups assume there's no difference, but there is, and that results in the lacking cultural awareness and different assumptions. Then the last question is regarding the following: what interventions are needed to reduce or remove cultural challenges and barriers for cross-border business expansion? So first of all, the need for a platform that connects beneficial partners is highly a need, and that should result in a socio-cultural system together with all stakeholders, and followed by a need for acculturation training, so really improved cultural awareness and training for startups before they start to cross the border. Finally, the recommendations of this study. So for specific startups from Groningen that want to cross the border, hire a native speaker is highly recommended. Follow acculturation training based on cultural needs. And before crossing the border, clear-oriented international strategy that is aware of the cultural differences and international aspects. Then for the startup ADR itself, to offer a platform and to really connect all the important stakeholders of universities, startups, Chamber of Commerce, and experts, but also the startups that already crossed the border or have the ambition to get them into contact with each other based on specific industries or needs. And this platform can be established through an interactive, accessible application or an online program. So the accessibility is low to get into contact with each other. That was the presentations. Any questions?
Yeah, thank you very much, Joyce, for presenting. Can you go back to your recommendations page?
Sure. Yeah.
Thanks. I invite students around to actually pick one of those recommendations up and to ask a question about it, because they're quite. Who's willing to ask a question about one of those recommendations? Yeah. What is not clear?
How would you visualize this interactive accessible application?
So to make it more clear, visualize an application on your phone that connects all beneficial parties, and that because everybody is highly used to your phone or application, and instead of a website, what is working, I think an app would be more beneficial because it's easy to access. Imagine to have an agenda with online events, speakers or success stories, all usable information that is easily accessible when you're going to Germany or just need a specific topic and you can easily read about it. That is all structured in different settings or agenda points in order to make it easier for startups.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Okay. And who's going to make this, Joyce?
Well, good question. So an application should be done by a web designer. I think someone who is highly skilled for this. So a person should be acquired with the right needs that he or she understands to establish this application.
What would be the benefit of the application in comparison to, let's say, LinkedIn or using a social media page or the website?
So, good question. You have LinkedIn, you have the website, but that's a website that is general. So there's a lot of information and you need to look for it. But this application is highly practical. So you just can click every button with your needs or information about other startups, telephone numbers, or easy to connect with each other. And for instance, LinkedIn offers, of course, information and shares also events. But I think if you have everything combined into events or information or the databases of other startups, I think it's better to combine that in an application than rather a website and LinkedIn that is mostly used through your laptop. And the goal is to use by phone.
All right. That makes sense. Thanks.
Do you have an example of a site like this, not for the northern region, but for another region? Have you ever seen something like this in your life?
So I searched on the internet about, of course, creating a platform to increase connecting and everything. I haven't found any real comparable example. So in that case, no. But I read about stories to create or increase the connecting aspect of a platform or a community, actually, because this is also to gain a community-based platform, and that is definitely working to get people more interactive with each other.
Okay. You went through the critical friends session very quickly, but you did. Do you think that adding that to this website will make it better? Or
So you mean, how do you mean?
If we're adding this to the platform, it says, guys, you can have critical friends from Germany or you can have critical friends from the Netherlands. Do you think, well, it's beneficial, or do you think will it work?
Well, the process of critical friends is definitely working because you receive feedback from each other. So in that case, yes, and in this case, it should be approached in a way that the right parties are involved with each other. So for specific segments of industry, startups should be combined with critical friends that have knowledge of certain aspects, and then I think it should definitely work.
All right. We're almost at 50 minutes. Do we think it's smart to move forward? Otherwise, it might be.
Yes, please. Yeah. We're done. Yes.
Yeah. Do you have anything to add, Joyce?
No. Any questions? Otherwise, no. I'm okay.
All right. Well,
thank you, Joyce, for going first. So,
sure.
In Dutch, I think you say de spit van afbijten of so. Well, never mind. But
Spitzarbeit.
Verena, you may call on the next one. Just a brief strategic question: does it make sense to possibly have a cluster of all those who have similar subjects or topics? That would be Marvin and Murat, for example.
We can do the COVID bunch. No,
for example, and maybe yeah. Well, all of you try to keep it short. And Verena, do you think we should go one by one? Yeah. And then, or have all the recommendations first and then do
just one by one and then.
Okay. Let's do that.
All right. So I don't know it on top of my head, but who has the COVID topic?
I do. I'm talking about COVID.
Would you mind starting?
Well. Yeah, of course, sir. Okay, cool.
All right.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, perfectly.
Perfect,
Yes.
Yeah, welcome to my presentation. As you can see, the topic of the title of my thesis is the impact of COVID-19 on the hotel sector in East Frisia, threats and opportunities. And to give you a quick overview of the contents I'm going to talk about, I'll introduce you to the topic, of course. I'll talk about my research question and my sub-research questions. Then I'll go into detail about the methodology or the research approach. I'll present you the findings and the conclusion and recommendations. Well, obviously, COVID doesn't really need an introduction, but as you can see, this is a graph of the overnight stays in hotels in Germany. As we can all imagine, the hospitality sector was one of the most severely hit industries when tourism came to a halt. And as you can see here, there's a massive dip actually in overnight stays in March and April 2020, when the first lockdown, or the sort of lockdown, was decided. And another massive decrease in November 2020. Actually, the German government decided to shut down all hotels for tourism. So hotels were only allowed to host guests that travel for business. So yeah, this is a big problem, especially for this region, East Frisia, which is heavily reliant on tourism and the revenue streams. And they're actually only recently able to commence their business, I think in May. It always depends on the number of infections, but now they're open again for tourists. And over the course of the pandemic, obviously, many businesses were hit hard in terms of financial situations, staffing decisions, and so on. And that's why I came up with my main research question, which was, what are the impacts of COVID-19 on entrepreneurial behavior in the hotel sector in East Frisia? And this was based on the chapter Entrepreneurial Behavior, Its Nature, Scope, Recent Research and Agenda for Future Research by two authors named Bert and Schroet, which is also a book that's been used by a other student, by Georg, I think. So we used the same chapter to kind of align our research a bit. And based on that chapter, I came up with 5 sub-research questions. The first one was, what are the impacts of COVID-19 on leadership? The second one talked about the impacts on communication. The third one, the impact on the role of the hotel entrepreneur or behavioral roles. The fourth one, the impact on creativity and opportunity discovery. And the fifth one talked about crisis management. So the first 4 areas were areas discussed by those two authors. And I also added crisis management because it's obviously a very important point during a crisis. So for my research approach, or for the methodology, I used Saunders' research onion, and I'll just quickly walk you through the layers. Starting with the philosophy, I used interpretivism as my research philosophy, since it's usually inductive, qualitative, and uses small samples according to Saunders. I used an inductive approach, since I started with a question, and based on that question and the data that was collected, I came up with a theory or recommendations and the conclusion. The research strategy was grounded theory, since it's widely used in qualitative business research according to Saunders. A cross-sectional time horizon was chosen because anything else would have not been possible within the given time frame. For my data collection, I use purposive non-probability sampling, which is often used when dealing with small sample sizes according to Neumann. And in total, I conducted 5 semi-structured in-depth interviews. I would like to conduct more. My initial goal was actually about 10, then I went back to 8, but it was quite difficult to find interviews actually, because well, most hotels had other stuff to do, obviously, than talk to a random student about their problems, and or they were either understaffed or just shut down completely. But I still got a lot out of them, because they're really in depth and lots of good findings. And well, after interviewing, I transcribed them obviously and analyzed the data using Atlas TI and using the grounded theory methods, so open coding, XR coding, and selective coding. And based on this analysis, I came up with the findings regarding leadership. Leadership became very impersonal most of the time, just because of the regulations, and management was often physically less present. The impact on staff communication was generally good, as most hotels continue to stay in touch with their employees. Guest communication, however, was impacted negatively, because it just became very impersonal due to the restrictions and the 1.5 meter rule, for example. However, many hotels discovered or improved communication channels, especially online channels like social media or their website presence, just to stay in touch with their customers and remind them that the hotel is still there and waiting for them after the pandemic. The behavioral rules, or the rules of the entrepreneurs, were impacted in a way that management often had to take on new supporting tasks, such as helping out with breakfast or supporting housekeeping. Positive changes included staff taking on more responsibilities due to an increase of trust. So having a good number of staff, or a how do you say that? Decent amount and decent people that work for you, was very important to me in the crisis, obviously. And however, being a good host for most entrepreneurs or most management people became very difficult, just again due to the restrictions and the impersonal atmosphere that was created as a result. Regarding creativity, lots of creativity was obviously needed, for example, regarding changes to catering, applying hygiene rules, or using existing produce to avoid spoilage. There were some new catering opportunities, like introducing tailored breakfast, or an honesty bar. Honesty bar, if you don't know, is like a bar that's not staffed, so people can just take what they want and just leave the cash, so it's just based on honesty. That's what one hotel introduced. But most of those opportunities were actually merely necessity and might not be continued after the pandemic. Other opportunities, however, included digitalization, because some hotels received subsidies, for example, to improve their website, or just improve their social media presence in general. Other opportunities included renovations, which normally would have not been possible if your hotel is completely booked out, and workflow improvements. And the last chapter, or the last area I explored, is crisis management. This included the reduction of staff for most hotels, not hiring any staff at all. I talked to one hotel that actually launched their business in March 2020, was only open for 14 days, so he did not hire any staff at all, because it didn't make sense for him, obviously. And cutting as many costs as possible was generally the idea or needed for most businesses, and applying for government aids. And all interviews said that it was important to remain positive, to stay motivated, and just to make the best of the situation. And to conclude, most negative impacts concern the leadership style, the guest communication, behavioral rules, staff decisions, and the financial situations. And the positive impacts mostly included impacts on the leadership as well, staff communication, and new opportunities, for example, in catering or digitalization. And based on the findings, it is recommended that hotels do the following things. Excuse me. For example, first of all, establishing excellent communication channels, with both staff and customers, for example, by improving the online presence of the hotel and staying in touch that way. Secondly, catering alternatives should be introduced early to stay in line with possible regulations and to reduce product spoilage. Third, the introduction of key boxes can be great workflow improvement, even without a crisis, because it just offers flexibility both to the guests and the hotel, because it also reduces staff. Fourth, investing carefully. So investments should be made if possible, but carefully, since, for example, renovations are normally not possible under normal circumstances. And lastly, subsidies should be applied for as early as possible, because it can take very long to receive, especially in Germany. Some hotels told me that they applied for a government aid 4 months ago and they still haven't received it. So it's very important, especially for hotels with little or no cash flow at all. So yeah, that's it from my side. Those are the two references I used, and let me know if you've got any questions.
Right, thank you.
Okay.
Really interesting. What do you mean by introducing key boxes?
Well, key boxes are boxes outside where guests can just retrieve their keys from, even without outside check-in hours. So if guests arrive late after 10 p.m., for example, they can just scan their code on their phone and just retrieve that key that way. And this is something that was introduced during COVID, just because of this, the regulations that contactless check-in was needed. But it's also obviously a good workflow improvement even without COVID or without a crisis.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, Felix.
Yes, please.
That keyboxing thing is a good idea of serendipity. You did it, and then suddenly it becomes a happy kind of thing, and it's working.
That's true. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Do you have more of those experiences during your research that suddenly within Corona people find stuff out where they didn't look for?
Oh yeah, certainly. One hotel, for example, was focusing their business on just hosting events like weddings, for example. But now that this was not allowed anymore, they're actually considering to have even more rooms, because I think now they've only got 6 rooms and they want to expand to 20 rooms. And they've discovered that hosting weddings is actually quite a lot of work. So when weddings were not allowed, but for example, like trade fairs were still allowed, they offered that. And they also offered, rented out their premises to schools, to have, well, not fairs, but like kind of presentations. So this was a completely new market for them, and a good source of income, because it made things much easier, and they discovered that it's very scalable.
Okay, thank you.
That's one example.
Someone else? We've got those beautiful recommendations.
Would you say that catering has become basically a second leg of most hotels, like they will continue it after COVID?
What do you mean exactly? That the focus will be more on catering after COVID or less on catering?
Yeah, that it will stay on catering.
Well, I mean, yeah, it's for most hotels, it's obviously part of it, part of the the offer that you can eat, have dinner or have breakfast. But what changed during COVID was that, for example, like buffet style breakfast was not allowed anymore. So hotels started serving breakfast directly, which resulted in less spoilage, for example, which was good. And hotels could take into account certain allergies, for example, and just make the breakfast more tailored to the customer's needs. So that's something positive. Some hotels also introduced takeaway services, especially one on the German island, where not a lot of takeaway services were available. But they said that they're not going to continue after COVID, because they've just not got enough staff for it. Because now they staff, or well, not anymore, but like when I talked to them, they staff could focus entirely on just preparing those takeaway orders. because they had no guests basically. But after the crisis on now, they focus us back to the normal business day-to-day operations bit really.
Oh, that's very interesting. Thank you.
Anyone else?
Oh, sorry. Did someone say something?
Oh no, I just said anyone else.
Yeah, sorry.
I have a question.
Go for it.
So I'm wondering, because you're talking about the key boxes and like catering, and so it kind of sounds like their efficiencies are going up and like they're hiring less people. Do you think in the future there's going to be less jobs for people working in hospitality because of like them realizing like, oh my God, we don't need this many people to be like a good business?
I'm not sure, because many hotels said that they actually would have liked to hire people, and for example, well, I think none of the hotels I talked to want to continue having contactless check-in, because they think that just having a person at the check-in desk is part of it and just makes for a good atmosphere. They do want to continue obviously using the key boxes, but contactless check-in and hiring less staff for the check-in desk is not an option for any of the hotels I talked to. What I do think is that less people would probably want to work in this area, because job security is very low. People know that by now. And also the hotels I talked to that were still hiring said that the expectations of the applicants were actually really, really high, and much higher than what could be offered. So I think it's going to be difficult. Job market's going to get more difficult in the future after the COVID, even though obviously there will be a boom in tourism once all the restrictions are being lifted again.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome.
All right. Thank you, Felix, for your presentation. We just passed 60 minutes, so
Yeah.
I think it's time to move on and see what Richard will tell us.
Yes, just let me set up my screen really quickly. Oops, hold on. I'm sharing my screen now. It should be available.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Let me just. There we go. Okay. So my name is Richard Schuring, and today I'm going to be telling you about the impact of COVID-19 on restaurant entrepreneurs in Groningen. I'll be focusing on what threats and opportunities have arisen as a result of the pandemic and what entrepreneurs can do to improve their situation. The reason this thesis is relevant is because the average restaurant in Groningen is facing a debt of over 180,000 euros, which means it's facing the most debt of any province in the Netherlands, really. So my methodology, I'm just going to cover it very briefly. First, I conducted a literature review to identify points of interest for my research. I then used the literature review to make interview questions, and I conducted these interviews with restaurant entrepreneurs in Groningen. I asked these entrepreneurs if they had anything that they wanted to ask the customers through the survey, and then I conducted the survey with restaurant customers in Groningen with a sample size of 111. So here are my research questions. I'm going to go over them a little bit later, but here's just a very brief overview of them. But first, I'd like to talk about the perception of the pandemic in Groningen in general. So I did some analyses with the customers' hygiene demands in comparison to their demographics, and I found that the only difference is that people with high educations fear the pandemic more than those with low educations. There's no relationship between a person's gender, age, income, marital status, or having children, and how much they fear the pandemic. And also what's interesting to note is that people believe fake news surrounding the COVID-19 pandemic. For example, as you can see in this graph, 34.2% of respondents in Groningen believe that the COVID-19 pandemic is transmissible through food consumption, which the World Health Organization has said on many occasions is simply not the case. Also, 25% of customers believe that COVID is more transmissible through cold foods than through hot foods, which is also fake news. So what does this tell us? This tells us that it's important for restaurant entrepreneurs to consider the customer's emotions rather than empirical evidence when making implementations for the COVID-19 pandemic. So I'd like to go through my sub-research questions now. Question 1. How has the customer's willingness to eat restaurant food been impacted by COVID-19? Well, demand for ordering food has increased. The mean demand for ordering food before the pandemic was 1.17 out of 4, by the way, and it's become 1.84 since the start of the pandemic. The main reasons for the increase in ordering demand are pretty much what you would expect. Dining in has become a substitute for eating in restaurants. People want to support their locals, and people are feeling a little bit bored and lethargic during the pandemic, which leads to a lack of motivation to cook. Restaurants who have done well have also reallocated staff to fostering the takeaway strategy. Often in the Netherlands, you can't really fire employees if they've just signed a new contract. So a lot of restaurants have employees that they just can't use, for example, wait staff. So they have reallocated these staff to doing delivery work to avoid the costs that come with using a service like Das Bezorgd. Implementing a takeaway strategy has meant that menu revisions have had to be made. For example, restaurants can no longer offer samples between meals, and complex dishes have been removed in favor of a takeaway strategy. Question 2. What lessons can Groningen's restaurant entrepreneurs struck by COVID-19 learn from previous disasters? Well, first, I'd like to install some optimism within the Dutch restaurant entrepreneurs, because when comparing COVID-19 to past disasters, we can see that COVID-19 really isn't that bad. The Dutch restaurant industry has shrunk by 37% since the start of the pandemic. Yes, it sounds like a lot, but when you compare it to, for example, Hurricane Katrina, the restaurant industry shrunk by 70%. And the Katrina victims rebuilt within 9 months. In order to rebuild so quickly, these people made budget cuts, but they made an exception for the marketing budget, which is interesting as it seems very counterintuitive to not make a cut on a budget during a crisis. People actually invested more into marketing because competition was going bankrupt, and you wanted to absorb these costs by increasing your marketing strategy. So they basically increased the budget, and this paid for itself by attracting new customers. Also, like I mentioned, they reallocated staff to the delivery strategy, and they lobbied for extra government support and made use of existing packages. Packages that Groningen entrepreneurs can make use of consist of TVL, which basically is a fixed cost compensation package, and TOGS, which is no longer available, but was a one-time payment of 4,000 euros. The reason I'm bringing it up is because such a package might become available again in the future, and so it's important for these entrepreneurs to know about its existence. Question 3, what implementations have successful restaurants made? Well, first of all, the obvious, depression rates have increased during the pandemic, so successful restaurants have treated their customers with increased kindness, even if they seem irritable or rude, because people are just feeling a little bit more antsy, I guess. They also open for as long as possible, because fixed costs don't really increase the longer you open. So if you're profitable, you should open for as long as possible to mitigate the impacts of the pandemic. Customers, however, are very understanding of restaurants remaining closed, as can be seen by this diagram. I asked customers if they're understanding of restaurants being closed on certain days due to a lack of customers. 1 was totally disagree, and 5 was totally agree. And as you can see, the vast majority of people filled in 4 and 5. So people are very understanding of restaurants closing if they're struggling. Successful restaurants have also not renegotiated supplier deals, which again seems counterintuitive. But if you think about it for a little bit longer, it actually seems kind of smart, because suppliers, suppliers can't afford to give discounts to every single restaurant. So they're going to say no to the offer anyway, and by not asking them for discounts, you're going to create goodwill with the suppliers, and they're going to give you better ingredients as a result. This actually happened to one of the restaurants I interviewed. They got the best ingredients from the supplier because they understood that they're also going through a crisis. Also, successful restaurants offer the occasional freebie to loyal or first-time customers. This is a very simple psychological trick. Like, I'll do something nice for you, and in return, you do something nice for me. So a restaurant entrepreneur gives you a free drink, and in return, you're going to give them your business more often. Question 4, which implementations are applicable to restaurants in Groningen? Well, first of all, none of the interviewed entrepreneurs market much, and this is where an opportunity lies. If none of the competitors are marketing, then you can stand out by marketing and absorb all the customers from the bankrupt competition. Also, restaurants increased their delivery efforts and charged for the service. But then again, other restaurants offered a 50% discount for first-time orders. So it's kind of up to the restaurant which way they want to go with charging for the service. Hygiene precautions should be taken, but more about that later. And it's actually all about the small things when making good implementations. Things like minimizing waste. The average restaurant in the world wastes 10% of their imports. So let's not do that. Also, a nice strategy that one of the restaurants did was offer masks for sale, yet give them away for free. So here are the hygiene measures that customers in Groningen value. If the alternate hypothesis is accepted, it means that the hygiene implementation is demanded by the customer. So the demands that are wished for by the customers are wearing staff indoors by masks and outdoors, the restaurant offering disinfectant, staff being gloved, separating tables indoors by screens, and removing communal bowls. Measures that aren't valued as much are separating outdoor tables with screens, and the measures don't have to be continued after vaccinations. So here are my recommendations. Competitors aren't really marketing much, so you can stand out by increasing your marketing budget. The hygiene measures, again, wear masks and gloves in and outdoors, separate indoor tables with a barrier, offer disinfectant, and stop using communal bowls. Reallocate contracted staff to the delivery strategy to meet the increased demand for ordered food. Make use of government packages such as TVL and TOGS if it becomes available again in the future. If your restaurant is struggling, close your doors and allow TVL to absorb the fixed costs. This way you break even by default. And focus non-mandatory measures on the customer's emotions rather than empirical evidence. That's it for my presentation. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to hear.
Oh. All right, thank you. That was really interesting.
Yeah, Richard, that was interesting indeed.
Thank you.
Does anyone have a question? Because I will have one for you.
I would like to know about the marketing. What kind of ways do you recommend?
Well, I didn't really go into what marketing methods they should use. I just identified that they should market, and an opportunity could lie here. If they do implement a marketing strategy, it should be tailored towards people who are higher educated, because the demographic that is most fearful of the pandemic is people with higher education levels. So if a restaurant does engage in a marketing strategy, it can be one that's a little bit more oriented towards education rather than emotion, I suppose. But the exact strategy in terms of whether they should hang up billboards or advertise in newspapers, I'm not really sure on that.
Okay, thank you. Richard?
Yes?
Can you go back to your recommendations? The last one, focus on non-mandatory, the customer emotions rather than empirical evidence. What does that mean?
Well, let's say the government doesn't mandate.
That?
Yeah, well, let's say a government doesn't mandate a measure, right? Should the restaurant base the implementation they make on science or how the customer feels? Well, they should base it on how customers feel, because customers believe fake news surrounding the pandemic, as I said here. For example, 34% of people believe COVID-19 is transmissible through food consumption. This is just not true, yet a lot of people believe this to be true. So if a restaurant makes measures, it should be to attract customers, to make them feel at ease, rather than to apply by some arbitrary empirical law.
Okay, I think that's a smart way of thinking. And do you have an example of that?
Well, I think I just gave you an example, didn't I? Or do you mean like a concrete measure?
A concrete measure? I'm your friend, you know. I'm just.
That's a very, very good question. Let's see, a concrete measure.
So people think they don't eat ice cream because it's covered with COVID.
Well, no, but let's say that you can catch COVID outdoors. Let's say in a hypothetical world, COVID-19 is transmissible by sitting outside on a patio, on a terrace. And customers therefore demand screens between tables outside, even if the virus isn't transmissible outside. Restaurants should listen to the customer rather than to the science.
Beautiful example. I like it. Next question.
Does anyone have any other questions?
Yeah, I do. How can that recommendation be supported in an ethical way, though? Because it's if you say like screw the science, it's all about making profit and attracting customers. Yeah.
I'm not saying screw the science, not at all. I'm basically saying if something is sufficiently backed by science and the government feels it necessary to implement the measure, then they should implement the measure. But if the government doesn't mandate something, then you can maybe err on the side of the customer's emotions rather than the science. But you should still obviously listen to the government.
Okay, so you're saying if it's backed up by science, but not mandated by the government, it's fine to base your measures around that, but you should still obviously.
If it's sorry, go on.
No, yeah.
Well, if it's going to stop the spread of the virus, then the government's obviously going to be mandating it. But in the case that it's not mandated by the government and it does prevent the spread to some degree, then restaurants don't necessarily have to implement it if it's to the inconvenience of the customers.
Yeah, I agree. Thanks for the detailed explanation.
Regarding your fifth recommendation about the restaurants making losses, when would a restaurant, for example, close their doors then when they're making a loss, or how much?
If their variable costs are so high that it causes them to lose money, or if they're breaking even after working a lot. Because the break-even point is measured by comparing the fixed costs to the. It's when the fixed costs are met by the variable costs. I'm not an accountant, but I believe that's how it works.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry.
Well, over how much time would that be? Well, over how much time would you measure that? For example, would you say a month, or would you look at that over a few months, for example?
I'm not sure it matters. Why are you asking the question?
Just, I want to know why. Well, if restaurants should just close, then instead of, well, sometimes making a loss is maybe, well, necessary to make profits, I think.
Well, if they're losing money, they should close their doors. I'm afraid I don't really understand the question. Oops.
Yeah, never mind.
Maybe someone else can paraphrase it in a way that I could understand the question. I'm sorry, I really don't understand the question.
I think maybe, Murat, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think maybe he means like staying open and making a loss, but having your face out there and people knowing you're there might be worth it in the long run. Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Like sometimes you have to do something negative in order to come out better on top. I think that's what he meant.
Exactly, yeah. So when you still make a loss, it's still important to be out there to still, well, have a reputation.
That's fair enough, but the reputation can be rebuilt quite quickly after the pandemic. People don't really have very long-lasting memories about these kind of things, at least in my experience. And also, I asked the customers if they're understanding of the restaurants remaining closed, and the overwhelming answer was yes, we're understanding of this, as you can see by this diagram.
Uli, do you still have something to say? Because you have your hand up.
I have a question, considering that both Felix and Richard worked on this topic. So question for both of you. Did you find any indication that on the one side of the border, something is very different from what's happening on the other side of the border? Did you find any areas where you could detect a difference between what you found in Groningen and what you found in Ostfriesland?
I mean, I did not investigate the hotel business in Groningen or the Netherlands, but I know that the restrictions were much different. The hotels were allowed to stay open in Holland, but not in Germany. So I think the impacts were quite different across the border, because there might have been, that's my assumption, that they have been more severe in Germany because they were not allowed to host tourists since November 2020, as opposed to the Netherlands, where it was still allowed, but obviously less tourists arrived. But I did not go into detail into. I only investigated the impacts on the other side of the border, I'm afraid.
Yeah, same. I didn't study the impact across the border either.
Well, I just thought maybe you talked and you noticed something which then in turn would deserve more in-depth research. But if you didn't That's fine as well, of course.
Yeah, I'm afraid I can't answer that question.
Okay.
All right. So we're about 17.5 minutes in. Who wants to go next? Thank you for your pieces, by the way. It was really insightful.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, Kasia?
Can I go next? Yeah.
Yeah, of course. Go ahead.
Okay. Let me just upload my. Okay, so is it possible to see the presentation?
Yes, I can see it perfectly.
Okay, so hello everyone. Welcome to my presentation about the GPJ. And my main research question was, how can SMEs on the German side of the EDR in the Oldenburg region in the startup sector become more internationally digitally ready towards the Netherlands? And before I get into the research approach, I would like to present a short definition of digital readiness to you. So it can be defined as the readiness of individuals, institutions, industries to countries in adopting and utilizing digital technology to acquire the maximum benefits from those technologies. So in other words, digital readiness means getting access to new technologies in the first place, and then also the ability and the skills to actually use new technology. And then several years ago, in the late 20th century, when computers first came to the market, there was a gap in digital availability because technology was just very expensive for companies to buy, and very few could afford it. Nowadays, however, it's way more affordable, and there's rather a gap in skills among businesses, so digital skills. And while some companies are very progressive and adopt early and are very skilled, other companies are way behind. And the goal of this research was to think about ways how especially smaller companies that have certain deficiencies could catch up and improve. And during the project, I researched digital readiness towards the Netherlands from the perspective of startups in Oldenburg. And just in general, the advantage of digitalization of a business is that you, as a skilled company at least, you can enhance your own internationalization process through technologies. So for example, it gets easier to engage in market seeking activities such as entering new markets, or you can reach customers easier, and then you can build a network and find international business partners, things like that. And a lot of companies might want to become more international and expand, but sometimes they're simply not ready for it yet. So before I talk about the sub-questions, I just want to show you the theoretical framework that this thesis was based on. As you can see, there's two perspectives here. There's the organizational and the individual perspective. I'm not sure if you can read the small boxes there. I hope you can. But organizational readiness is comprised of resources, culture, strategy, IT systems, innovation balance, cognitive skills, and partnership readiness. And then the individual viewpoint of employees is based on their personal innovativeness, attitudinal readiness, action readiness, and the emotional response towards technology. So how did I structure the research? For the first sub-question, I conducted quantitative research through a survey, and I really tried to research the current state of digital readiness of startups in Oldenburg, and I tried to figure out possible weaknesses that could be improved. And then for the second sub-question, I conducted qualitative research using expert interviews, and I really tried to figure out the desired state of digital readiness and how successful companies are organized. And then lastly, for the third sub-question, by combining all the findings, I tried to figure out what are practical ways to actually improve readiness. And of course, I looked at the weaknesses from that showed on the first sub-question. And I also tried to find practical ways for startups in particular, because if you think about startups, those recommendations should be fast and inexpensive to implement because of the nature of of a startup. Then for the findings, I used some colors to make it more obvious here. So green is good, yeah, orange is in the middle, and then red is bad. As you can see here, individual readiness, IT readiness, strategic readiness, those were the strongest categories, and then cultural readiness and innovation balance were around the average. And then resource readiness, partnership readiness, and cognitive skills were the weakest categories. So we will focus on these the most. And also to note here is that among the participating startups, which like 3 out of 11, 3 out of 11 are actively involved in the Netherlands already. And interestingly, those 3 companies had overall better scores than the other companies when we look at all the different categories. And then the findings for the second and third sub-question, I have to skip this because I don't have time, because I want to focus on the recommendations more in part, but this is pretty much how a company should act. So for example, having flexibility in allocating resources, having a modern culture, of course, stable and sophisticated IT systems. And then we will look at the conclusion here. So some of the participating companies are already engaged in cross-border activities, but there's still some room for improvement. There's some unused potential here. Very interestingly, market seeking and network seeking motives were the most important for the startups that participated, which is also in line with a previous literature that I looked up about smaller companies and how and why they want to internationalize. Between the companies that participated, there were big differences in terms of overall scores. And again, the internationally active startups performed better overall. So the weaknesses, resource readiness, partnership readiness, and cognitive readiness, the recommendations for these categories come in the next slide. And when we look at the specific questions from the survey, when we try to find the root cause why these categories were weak, we can actually see that companies had a lack of financial funding and also lack of international contacts. So for the recommendations, let's address the weaknesses first. So resource readiness was the weakest category. And to improve, startups could allocate more financial resources towards digital innovation within the company, or which would be more practical, to improve the efficiency of spending. So a possibility could be to involve employees and managers more into the planning of the digital budget and see what they actually need and what could be useful and what could be cut. Or especially for smaller startups that don't have a lot of employees, it could be better to completely outsource certain digital activities. That could save a lot of costs and reduce complexity. And for partnerships, it could be useful to build a professional and international online presence. So being active on all the different platforms that are out there and offering a company website in English is very advisable. And this way, it could be easier to get in touch with potential business partners and to present yourself well online, make a good impression. For improving cognitive skills, it could be advisable to offer more digital schooling for employees through seminars. And also like a cheaper and very modern method could be to offer custom-made manuals for the digital programs that the individual companies are using. These should be, of course, offered to all employees. And then it could also be a good idea to implement a very modern hiring process and place high value on digital skills in the first place. You could have something like a trial day where a candidate comes in and shows off the digital skills directly. And then for the other categories, I put this in one category here. I would say you could implement an open platform for idea sharing. For example, it could be in some sort of an intranet communication system, or you could use some sort of an app like Slack. There's different apps out there. And you should definitely, as a company, implement a direct and fair feedback process for innovative ideas, because you really want to motivate employees to share ideas and to make them just still do it. Very, very important would be the widespread adoption of digital solutions within the company. For example, you could digitalize certain forms and make things easier, or other daily tasks that you could maybe digitalize. And eventually, it's also important to motivate the employees. That could be done when you use a reward system like nudging, it's called, like a playful way of rewarding your employees for actually using digital technology and create value. Yeah, and they also should, of course, benefit from the digitalization through improved working conditions. An idea here, which is very prominent in times of COVID, is like, home office, because that's possible for a company that has good digital systems, that you can work from home and just continue wherever you are. Yeah, that's more important than ever. So thank you for listening. My reference is here, and I'm gonna skip back to the recommendations part, because I guess that's what we're gonna look at. Okay.
All right, thank you. Before I go in, does anyone have questions? Or I ask mine? Doesn't seem like, okay. So in relation to resource readiness, how am I supposed to visualize this like this? Because I assume it's more like on the digital side that you're preparing for resources. What kind of resources am I supposed to think of? Is this with or?
Okay, so we talk about all kinds of resources, human resources, like you have more employees, or financial resources to support digital innovation. And that could, come in different forms. But very importantly, for example, investing into the IT system, investing into projects that are about digital innovation, because, and then human resources, like if a company has resource flexibility, they can just hire more people. And that's some problem that I found with the companies, is that they didn't complain, but they said in the survey that, the financial funding was very weak, which is also in line with literature. And there was a big study in Germany about among all startups, and that showed that a lack of funding outside of Bavaria and Berlin, which is like the hotspot for startups, if you want to call it, like the Silicon Valley of Germany. Outside of those regions, it's very difficult for startups to get funding. So they need to be very careful how they spend it, and they need to make money very fast.
Okay, thank you. Also, I have another question to follow up on that. Have you also noticed a difference in platforms utilized? Because you're looking at Germans going to the Netherlands. Have you any difference in that Germans, for example, use other platforms to get their message out, or general their organization than Dutch would?
I actually did not investigate the differences particularly, because I only focused on German startups. I didn't focus on Dutch startups. But in Germany, the biggest side in general is Xing, but LinkedIn is very much catching up. But those are very important for presenting yourself online and finding partners and attracting customers as well. If you want to, for example, internationalize, you want to enter the Dutch market, you might as well present your company very well and make customers feel good and have confidence in you.
Thank you. Lee?
Yeah, in part, you already answered my question, but Kasian, I'm of course talking to. I'm always really curious if you go so much in depth for a GPJ in a certain area. I understand that you have a sort of tunnel vision and only look at that area, but do you, like, in your feeling, it doesn't have to be scientifically proven, do you think the right side, so the German side of the EDR, is more digitally ready, or the Dutch side? Or is it really that you couldn't say a thing about it?
I would definitely, like, just my feeling, I don't have data to back this up right now, but I would say the Dutch side is probably more ready because I think it's because it's a smaller country and they are more dependent on international markets. But in Germany, if you have a startup, for example, you offer some sort of product, you have 80 million customers, and then Austria and Switzerland, they are very much connected because usually if you have an online shop, it's like the DACH-Region, it's called I'm not sure if there's an English word for it, but so it's a huge market. So it's like 90 to 100 million German speaking people in those three countries. So you don't necessarily need to expand as fast. But in the Netherlands, the market might be saturated way faster. And also, that's also my personal opinion, is that Dutch people speak better English better than Germans because they need to. It's taught more. So I would say that the Dutch region would be more, at least internationally, ready.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you. It's, it all informs also our follow-up research on these. So it's nice to get connections, and even if it's your gut feeling counts for quite a bit.
Sure, yeah, that's a very interesting point. Yeah, I think I have a strong opinion on this.
All right, thank you. Does anyone else have a question now? No? Then I want to thank Cassian, and then we will move on to the following. I'm not sure who wants to go, or who is willing to.
All right.
Yeah, I could present maybe because I'm also in the region of Oldenburg, and I think it adds to Cassian's research as well.
All
so let me just share my presentation.
Yeah.
You should see it now.
I can see it perfectly.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so welcome to my presentation. My name is Marvin Kampen, and I'm presenting you today my research topic, which was covering the attraction and retention of Gen Z graduates in the region of Oldenburg. So the content of my presentation is pretty similar to the one that we used in the thesis. So I'm going to start talking about the problem statement, the statement of objective, the main research question and sub-research questions. Following this, the data collection, findings, and lastly, the conclusion and recommendations. So first of all, the problem arose based on literature reviews. So it was found out that human capital is one of the most critical components of a startup company because they play a significant role in the growth of a startup. However, it was also found out that startups face several competitive disadvantages here when trying to attract and retain human capital when compared to large corporations. And this might be because they cannot leverage their name, for example, and they also don't really have a really high reputation. Let me just use Tesla, for example. If Tesla is in your region and you can work for them, you already want to work simply for them because of their name. They have a really good reputation. And the market share also plays a really important role here. Furthermore, it was found out that currently in German organizations, there are three generations that work together. Here we have the baby boomers, the generation X, and the generation Y. However, little is known about the job preferences of Generation Z members, and they are born between 1995 and 2009. And previous research showed that they have different needs and wants. So I found it pretty interesting to dive deeper into this topic, since little is known about it. And I think that, Generation Z members are nowadays engaging in their first jobs or are graduating within the next years. So it's really important for startups to understand what actually these needs and wants are so that they can fulfill them and appear as an attractive employer. Based on this, I developed the main research question, which was how can the startup ecosystem of Oldenburg on the German side of the EDR region attract and retain Generation Z graduates? And following this, I developed 3 sub-research questions. So the first one covers what are the expectations and offerings of startups in the ecosystem. Here I wanted to find out how well established are ecosystems in Oldenburg, what can they offer? Then the second sub-research question was in terms of job attributes, what do Generation Z graduates expect from startups? So what are the most preferred job attributes and job preferences? And the third sub-research question tried to close the gap. So how can Generation Z graduates and startups expectations and offerings be met? So I then started my data collection. Here I conducted first qualitative data by doing semi-structured interviews with 4 startup owners located in Oldenburg and 1 external startup coach / expert that was also active in the region of Oldenburg. And following this, I developed a self-completion questionnaire. And here I had 101 final year students from 3 universities around Oldenburg that participated, and they had a business, engineering, or IT background. Yeah, for the first sub-research question, I found out that there are several expectations of Generation Z graduates. What was mentioned throughout the interviews was that they should be motivated, knowledgeable, and self-sufficient. Also, practical experience was mentioned quite a lot. So having an internship, work experience would be definitely an advantage. And the personality and work ethic was really important to startups, since it should be a really good fit between the employee and the employer. And however, based on the statement of the startup coach, it was found out that startups sometimes have too high expectations. So they want too much from a potential employee. And this often then creates a mismatch between the employer and employee, which will then lead to the employee quitting and not continuing to work for the startup. Following this, I just talked about it. I have 7 dimensions that I tested based on the literature review. So here I had the economic dimension. Here it was found out that startups can offer a market average salary. So they try to compete against other companies. However, it was found out that they have a pretty high lack of resources. As Kassian already previously mentioned, they really struggle to find funding, and they often don't have it. And if they have it, it's most of the time a really small funding. So they really don't have a lot of money that they can invest into the economic dimension so that they can offer a really competitive salary. And something that was also found out was that the job security in startups is really low, simply because startups are most of the time very young age companies that try to survive, that have to compete against each other. And therefore, the survival rate of these startups is not really high. Then we have the development dimension. Here I found out that startups actually care a lot about the development of their employees. So they offer a variety of projects that is simply given by the nature of a startup. So they often work on innovative topics and innovative products and services. So they have a variety of projects that employees can work on. And it was also found out that startups try to invest into the development of their employees by training, coaching sessions, and so on. However, here again, a limitation was the lack of resources. They simply couldn't invest that much into these coaching sessions because they didn't have enough funding. Yeah, the interest dimension was also mentioned quite a lot by the startups. Here it was mentioned that they are most of the time working on an innovative product or service that is also changing the environment within the next years. Therefore, they argued that their working environment and also like the whole startup environment is really interesting to the employee. Moving on to the application dimension, tried to focus if, for example, graduates in this case can apply what they have learned on the job. which was also emphasized on by the startups, since they said that they really need like people who can apply the knowledge that they actually learned, and that they also might learn within the development mentioned, so that if they have coaching, that they have the ability to apply this gained knowledge directly on the job. Yeah, then I also found out that the social dimension is something that was emphasized on by every startup, simply because startups are most of the time pretty small. They have a really familiar environment and have a really good team atmosphere where everyone knows everyone. They have a really flat hierarchy and everyone is allowed to talk to each other, give feedback, also criticize the work of each other. So this is something that was really well developed within the startups. Then we have the entrepreneurship dimension. The entrepreneurship dimension was also emphasized on by a lot of startups. Again, here the size of the company played an important role, because employees could simply watch over the shoulder of the CEO and watch how he or she was doing the job. So you could learn basically directly from the startup owner. And then we had the freedom dimension, what was also emphasized on by the startups, where the work-life balance was mentioned quite often, so that they had a flexible working schedule, for example, that employees could plan how they would work during given time frames. And yeah, overall, I found out that the startups are really well established in Oldenburg regarding these dimensions. However, the most major limitation was the lack of funding, the lack of resources, having not a lot of money, which plays obviously a big role when they want to invest in these things, but simply can't. Let's move on to the second research question. Here I wanted to find out what the expectations are of the Generation Z graduates when considering a startup as a potential employer after graduating. And here I used 35 attributes within a questionnaire, and this graph shows now the 10 most preferred job attributes. These are above a mean of 4.0, and I tested them on a 5-point Likert scale. And then we can see that, for example, having a flexible work-life balance was one of the most preferred job attributes, closely followed by having a good relationship with your colleagues, gaining career-enhancing experience. And here I mainly found out that the most preferred job attributes link really well with the offerings, so the 7 dimensions that I previously mentioned of the startups. So as I just mentioned, when talking about the freedom dimension, I just said that startups can offer a really flexible work-life balance. And this is also something that was really preferred by Generation Z graduates. So then the question is, how can this gap be closed? So how can startups make use of this attribute that is given in their startup, and how can they market it to the Generation Z graduates? And this will be covered here in the recommendations. So how can the Generation Z graduates and startups' expectations and offerings be met? And here I propose to include an employee value proposition that is following a 5-step process. So first of all, startups in Oldenburg should define a precise startup profile. So they should mention what they can offer and how the company culture is, which type of service and products they are working on. Then second of all, they should understand whom they want to recruit. So here it is really crucial for them to understand that the new employees, and if they are looking for graduates, that these are members of the Generation Z, most likely. Not all of them, but yeah, most of them. So they should really try to focus on these previously mentioned attributes, and they should try to emphasize on them when, for example, posting job attributes. This following the recruitment recommendation. So while recruiting, they should definitely include these attributes that they can offer within their job ads. So for example, if they post a job ad on LinkedIn, they should definitely emphasize on having a flexible work-life balance, because this will help to attract Generation Z graduates. Then they should definitely make use of digital channels, because in my research I also found out that Generation Z members are digital natives, so they are really used to these digital channels and they use them quite a lot. So while doing recruitment, posting job ads and so on, they should post them on digital channels like Sing, LinkedIn, and Then moving on, the last recommendation would be to include also an internal employee value proposition. So they should emphasize the company's culture to their already existing employees, because this will convince them about the whole employee value proposition, about the goal, the mission and purpose of the startup. And this will ultimately lead to employee retention, because they will feel closely related to the company. They know what they are working for. They have a common goal, and this will definitely foster the company's culture. And yeah, that was my presentation. Thanks for listening. And if you have any questions left, feel free to ask me.
All right. Thank you for your presentation. First of all, for those who haven't asked any questions yet, you want a chance to practice your critical friend method as well. Not a lot of enthusiasm. Right.
Yes, for me there is one.
Okay.
Is it also possible that you take lifestyle in consideration, how people have a certain lifestyle?
That startups considered a certain lifestyle, or how do you mean it?
I read a beautiful article about Munich, and a lot of startups, they actually want to go to Munich because they can ski there and they can have nice cafes there. There's a nice atmosphere there, so they move there because of the lifestyle.
Okay, yeah, I understand now.
So they just want to have a beautiful life, and they want to go skiing, mountain biking, and those things. So Munich is an excellent city for startups. Did you come up with things in your research that proves this?
No, I took a look at the startup ecosystem in Berlin, and I also found it out that there's like this whole startup vibe. So a lot of hipsters. Then also you have like these different districts within Berlin where you have different startups located, and people are really looking forward to work for them because it's really like trendy and hip. However, this is simply not given from my personal opinion. This is not something that is given in Oldenburg, since it's a rather small city, and it's not really known for being it's known for being a student city, but it's not really comparable to Berlin or Munich. And I also really didn't investigate that.
No, I was just wondering. But do you think it's Oldenburg can do something about it to make it a little attractive for people to stay or to start?
Yeah, that's what I also recommended, that they definitely advertise this startup vibe, because this was really emphasized by a lot of startup owners, that they are really young startups that started this year, maybe even like last year, and that they are really in the start of developing the startup, that they only have a few employees, even if or only if, because some startups only consisted of the startup owner, and that this whole small startup vibe could be really marketed because they had a familiar environment, they had a really good team atmosphere, they were working closely with each other. So I proposed that they also should market this.
Yeah. I have a little present for you. I think you should put this a little more attention, because that is what Generation Z also wants, to be part of something bigger, successful.
Yeah, that's what I emphasized on more in depth in the recommendations in my thesis.
All right, thank you very much.
All right, Joyce was
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I have one question regarding the recruitment and digital channels. So you recommended to enhance the positions on LinkedIn or recruitment methods online. But did you experience then the startups that are looking for people not yet are doing this sufficiently enough, or is it only based on the desires of the students? Because I believe most companies do already attract people on digital platforms, right?
Yes, exactly. However, there was one limitation. Startups, there were some startups, like 2 of them, that didn't have employees yet. And I still asked them, how will you, for example, recruit young graduates within the future if you are looking for employees? And most of the time, companies didn't even think about it yet. So they didn't think about how they can attract and retain these type of graduates. So here I think that the recommendations will help them to directly see what is the best way to do it.
Okay, so they didn't thought about any
Exactly, they were in
ideas.
the early development process of the startup. So all they did was like basically looking at the development stage, and so that the company starts gaining pace. However, they already had plans to like further expand when it comes to employees, so that they want to have within the next month like 2 new employees that could help them with the development of the company. However, they simply didn't have time yet to think about the recruitment, which channels are the most appropriate, and also they didn't really know what they should advertise about the startup, simply
Yeah.
because they didn't have the resources and the time to look at these things yet.
Okay, interesting. And the students too indicated that the best way is through digital platforms like LinkedIn.
Exactly. I backed that up based on the literature review. Here, several researchers found out that the Generation Z members are like digital natives, so they are really used to these digital channels and they prefer them.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Okay, I don't know who's first, Kasjan or Richard, but Kasjan, go ahead.
I think I was slightly first.
Okay.
Marvin, I have a question regarding your thesis topic. Why did you focus this on Gen Z and not on, for example, millennials and boomers? Is it because startups aren't looking to hire these people, or do these people have no interest in working for startups? Why the focus on Gen Z?
If we go back to the problem, here I mentioned that little is known about the job preferences of Gen Z members. And as I mentioned, there are currently 3 generations that work together in German organizations. However, nowadays, the Generation Z members are engaging within their first jobs. And so I thought that it's really important for startups to understand when they, for example, want to look for graduates, that they really understand what these different needs and wants are, so that they can appear as an attractive employer. And therefore, I simply put the focus on the Generation Z members, which I also then backed up again by literature review, because it was found out by several researchers that the employee age in startups is way younger than, for example, in large corporations. Therefore, I assumed also that they are more likely to hire maybe young graduates, and therefore the focus on the Generation Z members.
Is this love reciprocated by Gen Z members? Are they more inclined to work for startups than millennials and boomers?
Yeah, there was actually an interesting workplace study that was conducted worldwide, which included Generation Z members, and they found out that Generation Z members have way more entrepreneurial spirit than, for example, compared to the Generation Y, for example, so that they are also way more likely to engage in such jobs.
Why do you think that is?
That's a good question. I think nowadays people really enjoy I think I can even back it up with the findings of my research, because most of the startup owners mentioned that they have a really innovative product or service that is also trying to aim for the better. For example, 2 companies, they worked on some product that would help fight the climate change. So I think that this is also like a trend that can be seen nowadays with members of the Generation Z. They really care about the fighting the climate change, and that they can prevent this. So maybe there's also a trend in working then for such startups that try to actively make a change.
Oh yeah, they're a little bit more green than large corporations, is what you're saying.
For example.
All right, interesting.
Right.
Thanks.
Okay.
I totally love the fact that finally we have a really good discussion or conversation going on here. That's really interesting questions. That is lovely. We have 2 more parties to go. So I would suggest that Murat, that you go first. Keep the whole methodology stuff as short as possible. Because you had a similar thing as Marvin, and then come to the recommendations as a focus.
I will try to. Yeah. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Thank you for being here today. My topic is actually the same as Marvin's. We have researched the same concept. Well, my topic is called the attractiveness of a startup in the Drenthe startup ecosystem. So my research was more based on the Drenthe side of the EDR. Today, I'm going to talk to you about the introduction and research problem, my research approach, which Marvin already has presented to you. And then I will present you my findings and conclusions and recommendations. The presence of human capital in the startup ecosystem plays a huge role, is very important for the successful growth of a startup company. It is also recognized as the foundation for competitive advantage for companies. However, especially startups in smaller and more regional ecosystems may have difficulties in attracting and retaining the right talent because of the lack of human capital available in a small region. Mr. Bucker and Mrs. Laga had found that university graduates preferred to move to bigger ecosystems, to top-tier ecosystems, to the disadvantage of, for example, the Drenthe startup ecosystem. Therefore, the objective of my research was also to find out how the Drenthe startup ecosystem could attract and retain young graduates, despite regional disadvantages such as the absence of large firms and the absence of universities and a lack or a low unemployment rate in the region, causing difficulties in the labor market. My research questions are basically the same as Marvin's. So firstly, the first sub-research question was comparing the expectations or presenting the expectations of startups as well as what they offer in terms of job attributes. The second sub-research question was about the expectations of graduates on the other hand. And the third sub-research question is a comparison about the gap between the two. The nature of the research was exploratory and descriptive, and a mixed method of qualitative and quantitative research was used to answer the research questions. The goals of the semi-structured interviews were to find out the target population of the research, as well as find out what job attributes, explore the job attributes offered by startups in Drenthe. These interviews were held with co-founders or founders of startups in Drenthe with an employee size of less than 10 employees and companies that were founded less than 5 years ago to have a similar group with the same characteristics. On the other hand, the questionnaire was used to measure the perceived importance of the job attributes introduced in this research. The students were selected based on a few criteria, which were that they are in their final year, to have graduates, to test the graduates, as well as from the Hanse University and NHL Stenden in Emmen, and from specific programs related to business, IT, communication, and marketing. And a total of 170 valid respondents were found and tested on a 5-point Likert scale. The concept used throughout this research was the employer attractiveness concept, which Marvin briefly described. The first 5 dimensions in the scale are adopted from the theory. However, to make the scale more applicable, applicable in the context of startups, new attributes and new dimensions were added to the scale of startup attractiveness, which suggests that there exists a relationship between the attractiveness of a startup and the attraction and retention of young graduates. These new attributes were based on the findings of semi-structured interviews and previous evidences. In terms of the findings, even though soft qualifications were found to be important to startups, there was no focus on those personalities or skills because of the purpose of the research. However, in terms of the job attributes, no generalization could also be made because different companies offer different things to their employees. However, 3 new attributes that were not considered before were added based on the interviews to have a scale of 34 items divided into 7 dimensions that I just showed you. And additionally, startups confirmed that they also have difficulties in their recruitment processes, mainly because of their lack of resources and uncertainties that they have. In the findings of my questionnaire, it can be seen that the social and development dimensions and attributes were found to be the most important with the highest means, while the economic and application dimensions were found to be the least important. In terms of the individual attributes, this table represents the attributes that were found to be the most important, of which 5 are from the social dimension, 2 are from the development and interest dimension, and 1 are from the freedom and application dimensions. From these results, it can be seen that a social environment with good relationships is important to the graduates, and they are also motivated by development possibilities in the company and the usage of their creativity and a flexible work-life balance, for example, scoring a high score. Moreover, there are several recommendations that can be made towards the Startup EDR project and startups individually. With the results of this research, the Startup EDR project will be able to help and support startups in the Drenthe region to build their employer brand, in which they can offer the suggested job attributes to become an attractive place to work and ultimately attract and retain young graduates. Moreover, it is important that the startups emphasize the attributes that they can offer instead of the attributes that they cannot. For example, if a high salary and job security are not able, if companies are not able to offer a high salary or job security, for example, it is important that they focus on offering and emphasizing a flexible work-life balance or development possibilities. Additionally, there are also several initiatives startups can take to attract and retain young graduates. For example, they can offer social environment activities in which they do things together with the team to boost the team atmosphere. And it is important that they discuss this with the team to find out what can be done after work, for example. Additionally, companies should also offer their employees to be a part of their company journey, which would help the employees feel accepted, feel belong to their company, know that there are development possibilities, know that they have a little job security in their company, and that they really feel good about working for their company. So startups should show that they want to become successful, and they should show that they want an employee to be a part of that process as well. There are also there's also a recommendation to the universities in the EDR project. A startup indicated that the startup concept was not understood well by students entering the job market, and therefore that the that universities should introduce konuşmadayım. Excuse me, sorry for that. And that startups should that universities should introduce the concept or continue to present the concept of startups in their curriculum, in which can be done through offering specific courses, offering specific workshops or events that can be attended by students, and they can learn. And it is important that startups are not presented differently, but that they are rather displayed objectively as non-conventional employers. And lastly, there is also a funding program that is suggested to be introduced or implemented by the local government or other policymakers, which would tackle the issue of limited resources and uncertainties that startups have. This funding program would allow an employee or a graduate to go work for a startup for a certain amount of time while being paid by the funding program. And while the startup establishes and grows and becomes successful, they can take over from the program to ultimately pay the salary of the young graduate or employee. This was my presentation. Please let me know if you have any questions.
Well, thank you, Murat. This took quite a time. So let's pick one or two urgent questions. Who has a question for Murat so we can dive right into the discussion? No one? Well, then I'll go with my question. Murat, I know you did not research across the border. You talked to someone who did the research across the border. And the same question also to Marvin. But first to you, Murat, is there anything you noticed that is significantly different on the other side of the border as regards your topic? Something where you say, or to reverse the question, is there like a Dutch aspect of the issue that you detected that might not exist on the German side?
Interesting question, yeah.
And gut feeling is completely okay. Obviously, you did not research that.
Yeah, I think that there are definitely different needs and wants, but the companies indicated to have similar difficulties, similar things that they have issues with. When I was listening to Marvin's presentation about the findings of the interviews, similar issues, similar things were offered by the companies. But I think there's just different needs and wants that are based on the culture of a student, for example.
Okay, lovely. And actually, for us as Startup EDR, if we want to foster a cross-border ecosystem, we should be aware of the differences, but it's nice to hear that some things seem to be the same. So that's very encouraging as well. That's why I was asking. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
Anyone else? Question for Murat? Nope. Well, Murat, I hope you could also take something along from the questions that Marvin got. Some inspiration. Thank you, both of you. I thought it was really interesting. And then I want to reserve the last few minutes for Aisling and Dirk. Go as much as you can. Don't get stuck in the literature. Don't get stuck in the methodology. Present us your findings, your conclusions, and possible recommendations.
All right. Well, first of all, I'd like to say that we aren't GPJ students, and we haven't finished our research yet. Does everyone see the screen? The screen? Yeah.
No.
No?
No.
Huh. Second. Open share tray. No. Yes. Then yeah, we will talk about resource needs in the EDR. First, a short introduction, some key definitions. When we mean the EDR, we mean, of course, the Ems-Dollart-Region and the project. ESE means, based on the literature that we reviewed, entrepreneurial startup ecosystem. And an ESE actor is based on Diederik's paper, an education, network, expertise, support, and capital. So these categories are basically the actors in the EDR. I'll skip over the part how we got to our research question, but our main research question is, what are the specific resource needs of startups and entrepreneurs in the EDR? Yes, and we'll start with a small review of literature. Based on the different articles, we noticed that actors perceive startups' needs differently. One article that I basically got the idea for this research from was the study from Van Wille and Marine. And they basically said that no matter what actor they interviewed, these 5 tangible and intangible assets always came up as startup needs. So physical capital, financial capital, knowledge, social capital, and legitimacy. However, they noticed that for incubators, when they interviewed them, they always emphasize that startups need a lot of mentoring and they lack knowledge. And basically, that's what a project that wants to facilitate startups should aim in giving them as a service. While entrepreneurs, on the other hand, stated that they need that secondary, but rather they want financial and physical capital. So based on that paper, we developed a sub-research question, which is basically, what are the opinions of different EDR ecosystem members on the specific resource needs of startups and entrepreneurs. Next, we thought that startups probably have different needs depending on the industry type. So we looked at different articles, which basically say that, for example, yes, tech startups, for example, would benefit more from a university-based incubator and from incubators that are very specialized in tech-specific startups. While a tourism incubator, of course, wants a strong internal, a tourism startup needs a strong internal and external network, and an incubator with regional experience. While global startups need a lot of training and mentorship, which are specialized and focused on the actual internationalization process. Based on that, we developed a second sub-research question, which is, what is the difference between startups' needs depending on startup industry type? And I'll very quickly give the word to Aisling for next sub-research question.
Yeah, can you go to the next slide, please? So one of the sub-research questions that we looked at was the national culture's effects on the resource needs in the EDR. And I think I did quite a lot, so I'll just skip through it really quickly. I think personally, it's kind of hard to not talk about culture and not talk about Hofstede. I think most of the people here know about Hofstede, and I've noticed that he is in a lot of really important papers. One of the researches that I really dived into was a combination of Hofstede with the 3-dimensional model of Miller, which basically looks at like the 4 bases, the 4 like biggest dimensions of Hofstede, and it looks at 3 other things, because the 3-dimensional model is basically made of innovation, proactiveness, and risk-taking. And this model states that entrepreneurial orientation has these 3 dimensions that are the most important. And it looks at like the effect of, for example, individualism on innovation. And the last thing that I really liked and that I really thought was interesting is the entrepreneurial mindset or culture. So there are studies that believe that there is one entrepreneurial mindset or culture, which exists like throughout all of the world, and they think that it's more important and more influential than their national culture, which I thought was like crazy and like super cool. But there are more studies that don't agree on this, because they believe that like national culture and the world is always changing. And so how is it possible that someone in Japan has the same mindset and culture as someone in, like, for example, Australia? And one thing that I did find, one of the results that I find that I thought was really like a nice difference between Germany and the Netherlands is the Vrijmibos, which I don't know if the German people know this, but they're like the Friday afternoon drinks that Dutch people have with their coworkers. And for some reason, this popped up in every interview. So I really like seeing that this is like a very, very big difference on, like, because Dutch people, they think it's so important to enjoy life, quality of life, have beers, like socialize. And I think I've never heard something like that from Germany. So I think for me, that was something that really stood out to me. And I'm going to give the word back to Dirk.
All right, then for the methods and research design, we did qualitative research, as Aisling already mentioned, in the form of half standardized interviews. I'm actually very proud to say that we managed to get 10 interviews. I didn't want anything below 10, which was very hard and took a lot of time, way longer than I expected. Also, in order to look at Aisling's research question, we interviewed exactly 5 Germans and 5 Dutch people, and they are from every province of startup EDR, at least one representative. And we also paid attention to, as already mentioned, Diederik's sector of the different ESE undertakings, like Capital Support Network. We tried to get every one of them. So yeah, and we have transcribed them, but we have not fully analyzed the interviews yet. So I can only say some preliminary results. But basically, the interviewees and the literature, they both mentioned or agree on that startups are often not aware of the support they can even get. And also that too many service offers often also confuse entrepreneurs. So if there are too many different, I guess, startup aids, which aren't coordinated properly, entrepreneurs do not know actually where to turn to and get confused. Also that industry types important, tech startups, for example, require specialized support. And we also heard often the importance of university-based incubators and universities playing a very important part in the ecosystem for specialized labor. However, some interview-specific findings, which I could not find supported in the literature, which I found, however, interesting, is that to them, the most important resources for startups here in the EDR is human capital, financial capital, and mentorship. Also, a lot of interviewees expressed that there was a lack of structure within the EDR, so that there are too many different services which offer help to startups who do not coordinate with each other, which creates confusion. Also, that the EDR needs for incubators, not general incubators, but they lack very industry-specific incubators. Like, for example, IT Emsland is a tech specialized expert, and a lot of interviewees regarded or expressed that they would wish for more incubators within the EDR who are really specialized in one industry and can help a specific startup. Also, a lot of interviewees, they were very split on whether, for example, the clustering effect in cities like Amsterdam make it way better for startups to set up there against the EDR. However, most agree that the EDR also has many advantages, like its location, it's right on the border, so it's easy to cross the border. Also, the housing costs are lower than big city. And the same with the disadvantages of firm clustering, like in Amsterdam or Rotterdam, there's a lot of competition. So the EDR is less competition. So it's good for startups in the early stage when they are still I would say, weak or weaker as compared to already set up startups. And also it was expressed that people within the EDR have a very strong work culture. So yeah, some critical reflections. I thought that we were supposed to do this since it's a critical friend seminar. So I would try to be my own critical friend. I think next time my research or mine Iceland's research was very broad. So we should focus next time on industry type alone. And we should also clearly define all terms from an early stage on and have even more specific or even more sub-research questions because there are a lot of factors. And yeah, that was it. We have also references, but I don't think about them or to look at them. Yeah, thoughts.
All right, thank you. Are there any questions as of now? Because we're nearing 12 o'clock, so.
Well, I think it would be fair to give you guys a bit of feedback of questions along as well. I'm happy to see that despite of all the handicaps all of you had, you all were able to make something really good out of your research topics. Anyone who would have a question that might help Aisling and Dirk possibly rounding off their research? Dirk, then I'm going to ask you the same question. Basically, everyone was asked, and you don't need to prove it by research, but if you say follow your gut feeling, what do you see as the biggest hurdles or handicaps that actually keep all these startups? One, from asking for more help. After all, startup EDR exists, and two, to take the step to cross the border.
From gut feeling, I would say that a lot of startups do not ask for help because also cultural, where we come from a more rural background. I think the EDR, except of course Oldenburg, so people are a bit more risk adverse, I would say, as compared to bigger cities. And with crossing the border, I think for Germany, I heard very often that there is, they overestimate also the language barrier, but also that language is definitely a problem for German startups, or more of a problem as compared to Dutch startups.
All right. Uli, your mic. Uli, your microphone.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to say, Alexander, you can get the word now, but thank you, everyone. Thank you, Alexander, for hosting this, for teaching us. Thank you, Patricia, for connecting the dots. I mean, connecting should be our business anyway, for connecting the dots and getting Alexander in here. What I'm learning is next time, either shorter presentations or more time for everyone, or less people participating. So my apologies. This was a really, really, really lovely first round, but we're learning from it and we will improve the next time around.
Thank you, Uli. I think it's also important that we will start with the critical friends earlier, so that the conclusions of the results will also intertwingle, so teams will actually question each other. So I think that will be a good idea as well. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Whoa! Can we get you back?
Yeah, I will come back. Yes, please. I will. Yes, I will come back. And I really must say, I enjoyed the presentations. I'm into the startup community, and I think you really catched up with some insights I didn't have yet. So thank you for that. Um, Especially the idea that the cultures are not even that different. So and that there are still some great options. Thanks for that insight. And I look forward to your that you will have a lot of success during your presentations and your defense. And please be critical and to be a friend to each other.
Lovely. And I have to say, wow, our students are well prepared.
They are.
With every single one, I feel like, yeah, you may present. You did lovely jobs, really lovely.
I did.
So
yeah.
It's great. I'm very proud of everyone here.
Yeah, for sure. I agree. I have one last question to all of the GPJ students. If you would continue the research, what research question would you use? Can you email that for me? Because we're gonna have future GPJ students as well, and because all of you had really interesting research, and we would like to see if we maybe can follow or continue your research somewhere else. And since you have the most insight, we would like to know if you would continue research, what would your research question be? And if you can send that to me or email to me, that would be great. So we can see if we other students can use that.
And I would like to maybe even specify more. If you say, what are 3 interesting follow-up research questions that came out of your research? And should something not come out of your research, but it crossed your path, then just indicate that. Gut feeling is absolutely okay. I think all of you are experts now in a certain area. Trust in yourself and in the knowledge and the expertise you actually have acquired by doing so.
Yeah.
So we rely on you.
Yeah.
Well, anyone else who would speak any rounding off words? If not, then again, thank you everyone. This was lovely. This will be continued. This is so thank you for everyone who was part of this lovely experiment. Good luck. Good luck, guys.
Good luck with your defense.
Good luck.
Absolutely.
Thank
But
you.
you're already there.
And you will get your
Thank you,
certificate.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alexander. Thanks,
No problem.
everyone.
Thank you so much. Bye, guys.
All
Bye,
right.
everyone. Oh, yeah, and Georg, stay on. We'll talk for just 1 minute.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.
So let's see.
Because how would the certificates work?
Yeah, maybe let me just see. Georg, could we also meet tomorrow? Because today is a little tight for me.
Yes, that's completely fine. No problem.
Then let me see. Let me. We can. Tomorrow at 2 o'clock. How about that?
One moment. Yes, that's fine.
Or alternative, we could do 4. One of the 2.
2 o'clock is fine with me.
Okay, send me an invitation. Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Georg. Good. Who else do we have on board?
Diederik is still there. And we got Georg.
Yeah, Georg is logging out, I assume, and Diederik, he sent me a message that he was out of the office, so maybe
he's in the dentist though.
Yeah, exactly. That's what he said, and then not just a dentist.
No, for his jaw.
Okay. But anyway, Verena, we need to figure out how to do the certificates, right?
I already have it in front of me.
Oh.
So I can.
It's very easy, Verena. You just put the name in there and you just send it over in PDF.
Yes, that's my plan. And the date. That should be fine.
If you send me the list of all the participants with email address, then I can invite them for the database later.
Yeah, I will send you a mail ASAP.
And I think it went quite well.
Yes, yeah. I think so too. I think we will say, we will ask for 5-minute presentations next time.
Yeah, I think so too. And then also make little teams of critical friends. So now it was really who's going to ask the question, but we have to make little, and then we also have to start earlier. So I mean, we have to start earlier in the process when they come up with the research questions, when they come up with the first methodology things. So within the process, we kind of have to let them work within the teams.
That is, we will have a smaller team next time. I refuse to take on 8 or 9 of them one more time. It's just way too much. So we will select more. We will have 4, max of 5. And we can train them indeed in the beginning. And
yes,
and have them run their own intervention group that they meet once a month. They're working on everything only basically 3 months anyway, so that they would have 3 meetings, and then we can still have a round of final presentations.
Yes. We will also have a group of professional critical friends in Groningen, in Startup City, every Thursday. So we can send those students to them as well, and the only thing they do is ask questions.
That's
Is that an idea? So we have a group of finance and law students. We can ask to actually go to those students and just ask questions.
Well, finance and law are the 2 things most of our students are not doing. So we have to think it through a little bit more, but maybe we could schedule a strategic, or maybe we from Startup EDR think of how to best implement that.
That's good.
But,
that's fine.
I like. Is it? Okay, you go first.
Sorry, I'm running more or less out of time because I have to do something else on the other side as well. So I would like to talk further, but
yeah, no, that's exactly the reason why I say let's follow up on that. Let's think it in. But I thought it was very successful. Thank you so much.